Now let's turn to someone who's been following Washington politics for 40 years. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He joins us from our bureau in Washington. Mr. Ornstein, welcome to Bloomberg News.
Glad to be with you, Mark.
Sir, Hans Nichols at the White House, he was just talking to us about Peter Cook's interview with Representative Clyburn, the House Majority Whip, and the conversation turning, of course, to that public option. We have the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Max Baucus, proposing a bill that includes annual fees of $6 billion on the health industry. And then you have the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, saying that a public option is not essential to health care overhaul. Given this as a backdrop, what's the president going to say tomorrow night?
Oh, I think the president is going to indicate his strong support for a public option because he's got a substantial number of liberal forces who still see that as the be-all and end-all. But he will also very clearly indicate that he is not going to let health reform go right down the drain if we can't get to a public option. What Representative Clyburn said today also suggests one of these other venues for compromise, the Olympia Snow idea that came out some months ago to have a trigger where you tell insurance companies the goal here is to get real competition, real coverage, no more game playing, real efficiencies and fairness. And if you can't do that, within 5 years, the guillotine comes down and we'll have a real public option on steroids. That may get enough support from liberals in the House to get us over this hump and to get a plan through. And Max Baucus has some ideas that have now been floated that suggest that there might even be broader Republican support for a reform plan.
Norm, how passionate does the president have to be tomorrow night? A lot of people, even in his own party, have been critical, saying that Mr. Obama has not been passionate enough in his support of health care reform and specifically in support of that public option.
Public passion is not one of the things you see very often from Barack Obama, but we know that he can give a great inspirational speech. And I expect that we will see that tomorrow night. We're also going to see a real attempt to recapture the agenda on this issue. One of the real areas of trauma for the White House and for Democrats who want reform is that the opponents of reform have taken this over, talking about things like death panels and basically saying that this is going to lead to socialism in ways that I think have scared people, and the president's going to get them back. And my guess is the focus is going to be less on the uninsured, although that'll be there, and more on how all of us who have insurance would benefit immensely if there's no pre-existing condition, your plan can't be dropped, real portability if you change your job, no bankruptcy from a health incident.
And Norm, one of our columnists, Kevin Hassett, wrote an interesting column today.
My colleague, yes.
Yes, and his suggestion was that you ignore your opponents at your peril, that even though the opposition to this has been somewhat passionate at times, and even though some people have likened it to socialism or a form of socialized medicine, that it would be best for the White House not to ignore the emotional concerns of those who aren't in favor of health care reform. Do you agree?
Oh, I do, and I think you could almost call this the John Kerry principle. No charge, no matter how outlandish or seemingly unbelievable, can go basically unrebutted. In this case, it's kind of amusing. The anger that's built up or the fear over a government plan, given that we have Medicare, which is very much like the single-payer Canadian system, and Veterans Care, which is quite a bit like the British government-provided system, and they're both extraordinarily popular, is an indication that you can't take anything for granted in what people believe. So rebutting those things, but also reassuring people that reform isn't going to cause them to lose something, and that means the vast majority of Americans who are insured, is critical for the president.
Norm, is the final plan going to include a public option, and is it going to pass?
There may be a plan that will pass the House with some form of public option. I think the odds are exceedingly slim that any final package will include a public option. And here, one of the real challenges for President Obama, when we get to the bottom line, which is a conference report after the House and Senate pass what will be quite different bills, is making sure that his liberal base, including a lot of people like Jesse Jackson Jr., Lynn Woolsey, representatives in the House who have said, if there's no public option, we will not vote for a plan, making sure they back off of that kind of tough language and understand that if you're going to govern, you got to compromise, and that's what the compromise will be.
Norm, we have less than a minute left. Any chance that this is going to go the reconciliation route?
There's a small chance that in the Senate they'll use reconciliation. I think it's increasingly likely that whether it's through a deal perhaps reached with Olympia Snowe, Republican senator from Maine, or even one that has some broader Republican support, that there's going to be an attempt to push this out beyond 60 votes. It's not just because it's more practical. And reconciliation, while it's not some extreme measure, we used it, for example, to get the children's health insurance program.
But the Democrats are loath to go that way, aren't they?
Well, it's a very clumsy way to legislate, and it leaves a lot of holes, and it's much better to try anything else to avoid it.
Norm Ornstein, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, joining us from Washington. Norm, thanks.